Hello everyone, before we start, please subscribe for a story. It'll sure make my day. Enjoy. Mother-in-law mad my child played with the toy she gave him at her house. My mother-in-law is the kind of person who thinks she knows best about everything. Doesn't matter what the topic is, parenting, cooking, how to organize a pantry. If there's a way to have an opinion about it, she's already decided hers is the only right one. This has been a problem ever since my husband and I got married, but it got worse after we had our son. For starters, she constantly buys him things we've specifically told her not to. When he was a newborn, I made it very clear that we didn't want people to go overboard with clothes or toys because we had limited space. What did she do? Showed up with a trunk full of baby outfits and stuffed animals. "It's for my grandson," she said, like that made it okay. And if I didn't look thrilled, she'd act hurt like I was ungrateful or something. We've had so many conversations about boundaries. My husband's been great about backing me up, but every time we bring it up, she acts like we're attacking her. "I'm just trying to be a good grandma," she says. Why is that such a crime? It's not just the gifts, though. She has this habit of coming over unannounced. She'll show up on a random Tuesday, letting herself in with the spare key we gave her for emergencies. I've lost count of how many times I've been in the middle of breastfeeding or trying to get the baby to nap, and suddenly, she's in the living room calling out, "Anybody home?" We took the key back eventually. That led to a 2-hour argument about how we don't trust her. My husband explained over and over that it wasn't about trust, but she wouldn't listen. She still brings it up whenever she wants to make us feel guilty about something. The toy issue is what really gets me, though. We've told her repeatedly to stop buying things we haven't approved, but it's like she thinks our rules don't apply to her. She's always finding ways to sneak in something special. Once, she bought this massive plastic playhouse for our backyard without even asking us first. It showed up on our doorstep one morning, delivered by some company she'd hired. She didn't even call to tell us it was coming. We didn't even have room for it. Our yard is tiny, and the thing was so big it blocked half the patio. When I called her to ask what she was thinking, she just said, "Well, I thought he'd like it." My husband ended up taking it apart and hauling it to a donation center. She was furious when she found out. "That was a gift for my grandson," she yelled. "How dare you just get rid of it?" This Christmas was no different. My husband and I agreed on the wish list idea because we thought it would help her focus on age-appropriate stuff. We picked simple things: stacking blocks, wooden puzzles, soft toys, nothing fancy. I even made sure to include links to the exact items so she wouldn't have to guess. She ignored the list completely. When we got to her house on Christmas morning, the first thing I noticed was this giant box under the tree. I knew right away it wasn't anything from the list. It was way too big. Sure enough, when my son opened it, there was the construction playset. I could feel my husband tensing up next to me, but I just smiled and said, "Wow, that's a lot of pieces." Mother-in-law was grinning like she'd won a prize. "I knew he'd love it," she said. "Look at all the little trucks." The whole set was completely inappropriate. Not just the small parts, but also the sheer number of pieces. There must have been 100 tiny cones, tools, and other bits scattered across the carpet in seconds. I spent the next 15 minutes trying to keep my son from putting them in his mouth while mother-in-law sat back, watching like she'd done us some huge favor. After we opened the rest of the gifts, I quietly packed the playset back into its box and put it in the car. Mother-in-law didn't say anything about it, but I knew she noticed. She has a way of making you feel like you've done something wrong without saying a word. When we got home, I stashed the toy in the garage. I figured I'd deal with it later, maybe donate it or keep it until my son was older. Honestly, I just didn't want to think about it anymore. Christmas is supposed to be fun, and I didn't want to ruin the day by dwelling on her nonsense. But of course, she couldn't leave it alone. A few days later, she came over to visit and immediately asked where the toy was. I told her we were doing a toy rotation, which is true. It's something we do to keep our son from getting bored or overwhelmed. I thought it was a good enough explanation, but she clearly didn't. She started going on about how kids are supposed to play and how I shouldn't be complaining about having too many toys. "Some children don't even have any," she said, like that was somehow my fault. I tried to explain again that it wasn't about the number of toys, it was about safety. I didn't want my son playing with something that could hurt him. But she wasn't listening. She never listens. By the time she left, I was so frustrated I couldn't even talk about it. My husband suggested bringing the playset to her house next time so she could deal with it. I thought it was a great idea. Let her see what it's like to clean up after an 18-month-old who treats tiny plastic cones like snacks. Looking back, I should have known that wouldn't solve anything. When my husband suggested bringing the construction set to mother-in-law's house, I thought it was the perfect solution. If she wanted him to play with it so badly, she could deal with it. I packed it up the next time we visited, making sure everything was stuffed back in the box. As soon as we walked in, I handed it to her and said, "We thought it'd be nice for Dylan to have this here, so he has something to play with when we visit." She didn't seem thrilled, but she didn't argue. "Oh, all right," she said, like she was doing us some big favor by keeping the toy. My husband and I exchanged a quick glance, but we didn't say anything. We set the toy up in her living room, and of course, my son immediately got excited. He started pulling out the little trucks and rolling them across the floor. Mother-in-law sat down on the couch, smiling like she'd just won the lottery. "See? Look how happy he is," she said. "Yeah, he likes trucks." It didn't take long for the chaos to start. My son started dumping the tiny cones and tools all over the carpet. He was having fun, sure, but it was exactly what I'd been worried about. He tried to stick one of the cones in his mouth and I had to grab it before he choked on it. "He's fine. You're being overprotective." I ignored her and kept picking up the pieces as fast as he scattered them. At one point, he crawled under the coffee table to retrieve a little sign he'd dropped, and mother-in-law said, "Look at him go. He's so curious. That's a good thing, you know." I just kept cleaning up. When it was time to leave, we told her we'd be leaving the toy there. My husband said, "This way, he'll always have something fun to play with when we come over. It makes sense, right?" She hesitated, like she didn't want to agree, but couldn't come up with a reason not to. "I guess that's fine," she said, but she didn't sound happy about it. We started gathering our things and I figured that was all. But as we were putting on our coats, mother-in-law stood up and pointed at the mess. The little cones and tools were still scattered everywhere. "You're not leaving that here like this," she said. My husband looked at her. "What do you mean, we're leaving the toy here for him to play with?" "You can leave the toy, but you need to clean up the mess. I'm not your maid." I opened my mouth to say something, but my husband beat me to it. "Didn't you just say it's a small price to pay for his happiness? That's what you told us, remember?" "That's not the point. This is my house. You can't just leave a mess like this and walk out. We've got to get him home for bedtime. You can clean it up. It's not a big deal." She started to argue, but he took the diaper bag and said, "We'll see you next time." I picked up my son and we walked out the door. She was still yelling as we left, something about how disrespectful we were. That night, she texted us both, calling us inconsiderate guests and saying we'd dumped our responsibilities on her. My husband showed me the message and laughed. "She's just mad because she's finally getting a taste of her own medicine," he said. I didn't reply to her text, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. It's not like we did anything wrong. She wanted him to play with the toy and we left it there so he could. How is that our fault? The next day, I asked my husband if he thought we should apologize just to keep the peace. "She needs to learn that actions have consequences. You told her not to buy that toy. She didn't listen. Now it's her problem." I agreed, but I had a feeling this wasn't the last we'd hear about it. Mother-in-law has a way of dragging things out, and I knew she wasn't going to let this go. Still, I wasn't about to back down. She wanted to play games? Fine. Two can play that game. A week later, mother-in-law invited us over for dinner. I wasn't exactly eager to go after the mess at her house, but my husband thought it was a good idea to smooth things over. "She's not going to get over this on her own," he said. "We should just go and show her we're not holding a grudge." I didn't respond, but I went along with it. Honestly, I was more curious about what kind of mood she'd be in than anything else. When we arrived, she greeted my husband and son like nothing had happened. She didn't even look at me, though. She was all smiles as she picked up my son and carried him into the living room, making a big show of how excited she was to see him. Dinner was awkward from the start. She served some kind of casserole, and as we were eating, she kept giving little comments. "It's nice to have a clean house for once," she said at one point, looking directly at me. I didn't take the bait, but my husband said, "We always clean up after ourselves." "I'm just saying, it's refreshing not to have toys everywhere for once." The conversation shifted to other things, but she kept steering it back to the toy. "I put the construction set in the guest room," she said. "I didn't think you'd want to see it lying around again." My husband just said, "That's fine," and changed the subject. After dinner, we went into the living room to relax. Mother-in-law brought out a photo album and started going through old pictures of my husband when he was a kid. "See, I used to let him play with whatever he wanted," she said, pointing to a picture of him holding a set of toy tools. "I didn't micromanage his childhood." I ignored her and focused on my son, who was playing with a ball on the floor. My husband tried to engage with her, but she kept throwing little jabs in my direction. At one point, she said, "I don't know why you're so picky about toys. He's going to grow up just fine no matter what he plays with." I finally spoke up. "It's not about the toys. It's about safety and what works for our family. We've explained this to you already." "Well, I guess we just have different parenting styles, but I raised 2 kids and they turned out fine. I think we're done here." My husband tried to calm things down, but mother-in-law wasn't having it. "I don't understand why you're so sensitive about everything," she said. "It's like you can't take a little advice. It's not advice when you ignore what we've asked and do whatever you want. If you're going to talk to me like that in my house, you can leave." My husband took our things and said, "Fine, let's go." As we walked out, she called after us, "Don't expect me to invite you back anytime soon." We didn't respond. Once we got in the car, my husband turned to me and said, "That went about as well as I expected." I didn't say anything. I was too busy replaying the night in my head, wondering if there was any way to fix this mess. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that mother-in-law didn't want to fix anything. She just wanted to be in control. After the disaster of that dinner, I decided I was done putting in effort with mother-in-law. My husband kept saying we should talk to her, but I told him I wasn't going to chase her down. She made it clear how she felt, and I wasn't going to force some fake apology just to make her happy. Then she showed up unannounced again. I was in the middle of folding laundry and my son was playing in the living room. I heard the doorbell, opened it, and there she was holding a shopping bag. "I brought some things for Dylan," she said. I let her in because honestly, I didn't want to cause a scene on the front porch. She walked straight into the living room and put the bag on the floor. Out came a pile of toys, a cheap set of action figures, a noisy plastic keyboard, and some kind of electronic robot that lit up and made siren noises. "What is all this?" I asked. "Just a few things I picked up. He deserves to have fun, doesn't he? We've talked about this. We don't need more toys right now." "You're so ungrateful. I'm just trying to be a good grandmother." "Being a good grandmother means listening to what we've asked. We've been clear about this. Why is that so hard for you to understand?" "It's not hard. I just don't agree. He's a child. He should have toys." I didn't want to argue, so I handed the bag back to her. "Take it with you. We don't need this." She looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead, she took the bag and stormed out. Later that day, my husband came home and I told him what happened. I'll talk to her. The next time we saw her was at a family gathering. It was a birthday party for my husband's cousin, and I wasn't thrilled about going, but I didn't want to cause drama by skipping it. Mother-in-law was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table with a few other relatives. As soon as she saw us, she called out, "Oh, look who decided to show up!" I ignored her and went to sit down. My husband took our son over to say hello, and she started fawning over him, saying things like, "Grandma missed you so much. I've been thinking about you every day." When my husband sat down next to me, he said, "She's trying to make a point." The whole afternoon was like that. She kept making little comments loud enough for everyone to hear. At one point, she said, "Some people think they know everything about parenting, but they forget who raised them." I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and said, "Do you want to say that directly to me, or are you going to keep talking behind my back?" She looked surprised but quickly recovered. "I'm just saying, I've been a parent before. I know what I'm doing. This isn't about you. It's about what's best for our son, and you refuse to respect that." The room went quiet. My husband tried to defuse the situation, but I wasn't backing down. Mother-in-law said, "You don't get to tell me how to be a grandmother. I've done nothing but love him, and you treat me like I'm some kind of villain." "You're not a villain, but you're not helping either. If you want to be involved in his life, you need to listen to what we're asking." She didn't respond. Instead, she took her purse and walked out of the party. Everyone else just sat there, awkwardly pretending not to notice what had happened. We left shortly after that. My husband tried to talk to me on the way home, but I told him I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't going to keep doing everything to accommodate her when she clearly didn't care about our boundaries. The next morning, she sent a long text about how hurt she was and how she didn't feel welcome in our family anymore. My husband read it out loud and said, "What do you want to do about this?" "Nothing," I said. "She's the one causing the problems. She can fix them if she wants to." He didn't argue. I think he was starting to see my point. A few weeks passed without hearing much from mother-in-law. I thought maybe she'd finally gotten the hint and decided to back off, but of course, that was too much to hope for. My husband told me she'd called him a few times, complaining about how she felt left out and how we were keeping her grandson from her. He said he didn't want to take sides, but I told him it wasn't about taking sides. It was about her ignoring our boundaries over and over again. Then came the family barbecue. It was at my husband's aunt's house, and I wasn't looking forward to it, but we couldn't skip it without causing more drama. When we arrived, mother-in-law was already there, standing near the grill and chatting with a few relatives. She spotted us immediately and came over with this big smile on her face, acting like nothing had happened. She bent down to greet my son, making a big show of hugging him and telling him how much she missed him. "Grandma has a surprise for you," she said. I knew this wasn't going to end well. She led us to the backyard where she'd set up the construction playset on a picnic table. The whole thing was spread out. Trucks, cranes, cones, tools, and all the tiny pieces we'd tried to avoid. "Look what Grandma brought for you." My son immediately ran over and started playing. I stood there looking at the mess, trying to decide if I should say something or just let it go. My husband whispered, "Let's not make a scene." Mother-in-law looked over and said, "See, he loves it. I don't know why you make such a big deal about these things." I walked over and started picking up some of the smaller pieces. "He shouldn't be playing with these, you know that." "He's fine, stop hovering, let him have fun." I kept picking up the pieces and putting them in a pile. My son took one of the little cones and put it in his mouth. I reached for it, but mother-in-law stopped me. "Don't be so uptight," she said. "He's just exploring. That's how kids learn." "He's not learning anything by choking on a toy." "You're so dramatic." I didn't respond. I took my son by the hand and led him away from the playset. He started crying and mother-in-law rushed over. "You're upsetting him. Let him play." Mother-in-law: "If you want him to play with it so badly, then you can watch him every second to make sure he doesn't get hurt. Otherwise, this toy is going back in the box." "You're being ridiculous. He's not going to get hurt. You're just looking for an excuse to ruin the fun." "I'm done arguing about this. Either you respect our rules or we're leaving." She didn't say anything, but the tension was obvious. Other relatives started looking over, probably wondering what was going on. My husband tried to step in, but I didn't back down. I took the box and started packing up the playset. V tried to stop me, but I ignored her. When it was all packed up, I handed it to her and said, "This stays with you. We don't want it at our house, and he's not playing with it here unless you're supervising every second." Fine. If that's how you feel, maybe I just won't bother next time. Maybe you shouldn't. We left the barbecue early. My husband didn't say much on the drive home, and I didn't either. We were both tired of the constant back and forth. Later that night, mother-in-law sent another text. It was long and full of the same complaints about how we were keeping her grandson from her and how we didn't appreciate everything she did for us. I showed it to my husband and he said, "What do you want to do?" "Nothing," I said. "If she wants to keep this up, that's on her. I'm done trying to explain myself." We haven't spoken to her since. My husband said she'll probably come around eventually, but I'm not so sure. At this point, I don't even care. All I want is for her to finally listen and realize that this isn't about her. But knowing her, that's never going to happen. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.